What do you know about Nike? No matter where you look, all the stories about the company only pour out one positive thing, which is nauseating. That's why I'll tell you about the nightmare that Nike went through, how Nike almost went bankrupt nearly 10 times, how competitors almost brought them to the grave, and how the government screwed Nike over in every way possible, and how Nike still managed to stand up, rise from the ashes, and against all odds, overtake everyone and become a cult brand today. It all started with Phil Knight going crazy in his youth, dreaming of becoming a famous athlete, but he was kicked out of the baseball team and was pale and thin as a stick. But he decided not to give up and took up running, but even there he didn't achieve any special results. Actually, back then, in those days, running wasn't even considered a sport. All runners were seen as oddballs who burned energy like crazy. No one had even heard that running could be just for pleasure. And sometimes people even mocked runners. Some drivers passing by would slow down and pour a can of beer on their heads and yell, "Get yourself a horse!" And at 24 years old, Phil Knight thought that there might be some other way to feel what athletes feel when they win. And this led him to a crazy idea. Knight really liked the Japanese Tiger sneakers. He believed they would revolutionize the shoe market in the USA. In 1963, Knight went to Japan and found the shoe company Onitsuka, the one that made these sneakers. He met with their leaders, and the first thing they asked him was, "Mr. Knight, what company do you work for?" But Knight didn't have his own company. At that time, he was still just a mommy's boy, and he was so nervous that he almost wet his pants. He was about to jump up and run away, but at the very last moment, he held himself back and squeezed the first phrase that randomly popped into his mind. "Blue Ribbon Company." And he added to it, "In America, Adidas has taken over the entire market, but their prices are very high. If we enter the market with prices lower than theirs, it will be very profitable. The market potential is $1 million. The Japanese were stunned. They agreed and sent him a few samples to the USA. However, it was strange that the Japanese delayed the shipment for a whole 4 months, and when it finally arrived, there were 12 pairs of cream-colored sneakers. They were beautiful. Knight jumped with joy, held them up to the light, and gently stroked them like sacred objects. And then he showed these sneakers to his running coach Bill Bowerman, whom many runners knew, and therefore Knight hoped that Bowerman would buy a lot from him for his runners. And when Bowerman saw these sneakers, he liked them right away. But he liked the business idea even more. And he immediately entered into a partnership without hesitation. Bowerman was obsessed with sports shoes. In his garage, he handmade and modified shoes day and night. His goal was lightness. After receiving a contribution from Bowerman in 1964, Knight immediately ordered 300 more pairs of sneakers for $1,000. When the shipment arrived, Knight quit his job and began offering the sneakers directly to sports stores. This strategy seemed brilliant to him, but the reaction of the sellers was unexpected. They said, "Kid, the world doesn't need another pair of track sneakers." After Knight received a cold shoulder in several stores, he changed tactics and began offering the sneakers to coaches and runners directly at sporting events. And that's when the orders poured in. Knight hit the jackpot. It was hard to believe such overwhelming success. But suddenly Knight received an extremely grim letter from a seller in another city who looked like the Marlboro Cowboy and claimed to be Onitsuka's exclusive partner in America, accusing Knight of smuggling and demanding that he cease sales. Knight's business was only 2 months old, and he was already embroiled in a legal battle. Knight fell into depression. He looked like he had been hit over the head with a club. For some reason, Onitsuka wasn't responding to his letters, and Knight was ready to admit defeat and give up on his business. But he gathered his strength and went to Japan to sort out the situation. It turned out that the manager with whom Knight originally made the deal had left the company. And Knight met with the founder of the company, Mr. Onitsuka, and convinced him to return the rights to the Western states and ultimately saved his business. And immediately, without leaving the checkout, he made another huge order for $30,000 and returned to the United States. And he continued to reap the benefits, selling sneakers at sporting events. And then unexpectedly he met an old university friend, Jeff Johnson, who was also selling sneakers, but Adidas. And Knight said to him, "To hell with Adidas, let's sell Tigers." Johnson considered runners to be chosen by God and romanticized running as some mystical activity, and he was eager to help every oppressed runner. That's why Knight's idea of selling Japanese sneakers appealed to him, and he agreed. Knight planned to double his sales volume every time, but it required money to step on the gas, and he barely had any. Therefore, he took larger and larger loans from the bank, and bankers reacted extremely negatively to this. They said, "How can such a small company grow so fast? If you grow like yeast, you increase your own capital when sales grow, but the cash box is empty. Unbalanced growth is dangerous." In those days, banks were as short-sighted as chickens and only emphasized cash balances. They wanted you to never spend more than necessary. With Knight's zero balance, the bank considered him a time bomb. The slightest decline, and Knight would fly off the market. But for Knight, this growth was a matter of life and death, because otherwise, if he didn't convince Onitsuka that he was the best, they would find another partner. Therefore, Knight stepped on the gas pedal as if scalded. He ordered another batch of goods, took another loan, paid it off, and repeated it again and again, doubling the volume of supplies and annoying the banker who kept saying, "You need to slow down. You don't have enough equity." But there was nowhere else to go. In those days, there was no such thing as venture capital, and it was forbidden to use banks from other states. The First National Bank was the only place. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Onitsuka was constantly late with the delivery of goods. Constantly, not even the right word. Delays took precious time, which in turn reduced sales and therefore the money to repay loans. Onitsuka didn't care about Knight's problems at all, and he always had one irritating answer to all his desperate requests. "Soon." This is like when you call an ambulance, and someone on the other end of the line yawns, flapping their ears and waving their hands. Meanwhile, work was boiling in the hands of Johnson. He worked tirelessly, selling sneakers 7 days a week. And when there were no sales, he cultivated his customer base, writing them letters and creating the feeling that they were special. And how? Many customers, like addicts, became addicted to his letters. Some customers shared their problems. One, for example, complained that the sole did not cushion enough. So Johnson hired a shoemaker and performed a transplant of the sole from slippers into tigers, and the sneakers became super soft and dynamic like never before. Meanwhile, Bowerman was also not lagging behind in inventiveness. He noticed that tigers did not fit Americans well. Their feet were longer than the feet of the Japanese. And Bowerman modeled a new, comfortable model. Then Knight kept sneakers in the basement of his house. And when Johnson reached a record sales volume of 3,250 pairs, Knight's basement became too small for business, and he rented an apartment for an office. And a little later, they finally opened their first store in Santa Monica. And Johnson immediately turned this store into an incredibly cozy place where you could even just sit and chat. There was nothing like it in the world, where not only were products sold in a store, but customers were celebrated as well. Then came the alarming news that Marlboro Cowboy was pushing Tiger sneakers again. This cunning guy couldn't help but do what he was doing. He even placed an advertisement in a nationwide magazine. Knight created a powerful word-of-mouth campaign, and now this sneaky cowboy wants to pocket the profits. Knight headed back to Japan to fight for his rights once again, in order to finally shut down this cowboy's business for good. It turned out that the manager in Onitsuka had changed again. Knight had to ask for exclusive distribution rights for the second time. And he had every right to do so, because damn it, he did a fantastic job in 1966, selling shoes for a whopping $44,000. However, at the meeting, Onitsuka stated that they wanted a larger distributor with branches on the East Coast. It seemed that Knight was done for, but he didn't give up. He tricked Onitsuka by saying that he already had branches on the East Coast, and Onitsuka fell for it, granting him exclusive rights for another 3 years. Right then and there, during the negotiations, Knight made a super large order for 5,000 shoes to be sent to that same branch he didn't have and didn't have the money to pay for. And although it was a victory with a heavy burden. He had to take out another huge loan for this giant order, which greedy bankers might not approve. Plus, he didn't know how to open that branch on the East Coast. When Knight returned to the U.S., he immediately sent Johnson to the East to open a new branch and take on the large order for 5,000 sneakers as quickly as possible. But when Johnson found out about this, he was furious. His store was working like clockwork, and he didn't want to leave. And since he was the main reason for the store's success and an indispensable employee, he gave an ultimatum to make him a full partner and raise his salary to $600 a month, plus a third of all future profits. Otherwise, he would quit. Bowerman wanted to drive him away, but Knight did not want to solve this problem so radically. However, the arithmetic did not dance. The business still had a microscopic sales volume, and there was simply nothing to divide. This is a fight for a piece of the pie that doesn't exist. In addition, Bowerman did not want to sell a drop of his stake, and Knight also did not want to lose his controlling stake. In the end, all they offered Johnson was a $1.50 raise, and nothing more. Johnson did not want to agree, but he also did not want to quit his job. He loved it. It gave him complete freedom of action. And ultimately, he calmed down and agreed. And Knight and Bowerman continued to recruit new former runners as salespeople. In the following year, Bowerman developed a new model called Cortez. This model looked like it came from the future in 1967 and was perfect for long-distance running, with luxurious cushioning and stylish contours. That same year, Bowerman released his own book on jogging, called Jogging. Surprisingly, this book became a sermon for the entire nation, which collectively lay on the couch. Somehow, flames were ignited from this book, which spread with a circulation of millions of copies, ultimately changing the meaning of the word running. Running was no longer seen as an activity for weirdos. It became a super cool pastime. However, Bowerman didn't mention the company's sneakers even once in his book, so his bestseller didn't lead to any increase in sales. Nevertheless, thanks to the new supermodel Cortez, that year ended with good sales figures of $84,000. Meanwhile, the rented apartment had become too small, so Knight rented a new spacious but cheap office. Some of the windows were broken and there was no money to fix them, so everyone worked in sweaters. Knight couldn't even afford to pay himself a salary. Instead, he hired more and more salespeople, former runners. They were all wildly inspired because they loved the business, and the commission was $2 per pair of sneakers. They raced around school and college competitions at incredible speeds, increasing sales like crazy. But Knight sensed trouble. There was some unpredictability and suspicion emanating from the Japanese, and Knight recruited a spy, Onitsuka's staff member, whom he had met in Japan. In 1968, Blue Ribbon had already reached sales of $150,000. Shortly before that, the Wall Street Journal published an article about the company with a photograph of Bowerman and Knight, in which they looked like idiots, staring at shoes as if seeing them for the first time. When it came to advertising, Blue Ribbon's approach was always super primitive and awkward, like elephants in a china shop. Ignoring advertising couldn't continue. But in those days, there were no marketing courses. And marketing in general was a game of chance, and there was simply no time for mistakes. At that time, Adidas and Puma were using every means possible to lure athletes to their side during the Olympics, giving out huge sums of money left and right to almost anyone they met. Blue Ribbon didn't have the money to bribe runners. There was only one pitiful stand that produced almost zero effect. No living soul stopped at the stand. The main reason was the lack of advertising. Nonetheless, the business continued to grow, with 70% of sales among runners in the United States being Tigers. But at some point, Onitsuka claimed that this growth was their merit and extended the contract not for 5 years, but only for 3 years. Their attitude was contemptuous. They chronically delayed deliveries to the point of absurdity, and when the shipment finally arrived, surprisingly often it turned out to be the wrong shoe sizes or sometimes even the wrong models. As a result, the warehouse was always filled with dead weight. And the most popular model, Cortez, was constantly out of stock. And when this model finally arrived, it was already too late. Crafty Onitsuka first satisfied the demand of their local customers, and only then worried about exports. It was terribly unfair, but there was nothing to be done but dance to someone else's tune, waste time, and along with it, money. And the moment came when it had become laughable. There was simply no money for the next shipment of $20,000. To cope with this, Knight asked the bank for $1.2 million, but the bank's patience ran out, and they refused. As a result, the shipment had to be delayed. Bankers set strict quotas. They treated Knight like a beggar. To find the money, Knight decided to publicly issue 30% of the shares. He sent out flyers advertising the shares, but in response, there was silence. Not a single soul called. It was humiliating to tears. Knight, like a beggar, went to friends and acquaintances with an outstretched hand. But here, too, he was refused everywhere. He didn't know where to turn, and when he went to beg for a loan once again, he accidentally stumbled upon a Japanese bank. It was the Japanese trading company Niso Iwai, with a capital of $100 billion. Knight went to them and showed his financial statements. Niso liked fast-growing companies. If Blue Ribbon was a disaster for banks, then for Niso it was a gold mine. And Knight finally got his long-awaited loan. At the same time, Knight sniffed from his spy that it turns out that Onitsuka is planning a complete rupture of relations with him. They began working with other partners and were hunting for new candidates in the United States. And then Onitsuka disappointed even more with the sales of Blue Ribbon. In 1971, they believed that sales should increase not by 2, but by 3 times. During one of the negotiations with Onitsuka, Knight stole a folder with documents right under the nose of his manager during a break and found out that besides him, Onitsuka had a whopping 18 other partners in the United States. But the most interesting thing was that all these partners were set up against him. Knight was furious because he had dedicated 7 full years to Tiger sneakers, introduced them to the entire America, even invented new shoe lines that broke sales records and changed the face of the industry. And here's how these suckers paid him back for all of it. Knight was in shock. But despite the anger, he had no other choice but to continue to stay close to the evil. And then Onitsuka even offered Knight to sell his business to them, knowing that he simply had no other choice. Knight could not say aloud where he wanted to shove this proposal. He wanted to punch the manager in the face, but instead shook his hand and said that they needed to think about it to buy time because he still needed a supplier. After all, he couldn't just take and abruptly abandon the clients. To buy time, Knight sent letters to all competitors with a threat to knock them off their horses for a while. To overcome his dependency, Knight found a factory in Mexico and ordered the production of his own 3,000 leather boots. He needed to hurry to save the business, but Knight had no logo for his shoes. So he turned to a young artist, Carolyn Davidson, whom he had met at Portland State University. Knight asked her to create a logo that would be associated with the feeling of motion. 2 weeks later, the artist brought a whole folder of sketches. All these sketches looked like thick lightning bolts, plump check marks, and bloated curlicues. They all just caused nausea. But there was one sketch that everyone liked, the thickest one. It looked like a wing. It resembled the whistle of rushing air, like some vortex left behind by a runner. This drawing caught attention and looked like something new and fresh. To come up with a name, Knight's team went through a bunch of different names, spending a lot of time. But all of these names seemed like crap, and time was mercilessly ticking away. They needed to send the name to the factory as soon as possible because the boots were already in production. And at the last moment, Johnson called and said that in the middle of the night the name came to him in a dream. Nike. It sounded like the name of Nike, the goddess of victory. The name wasn't particularly liked, but there wasn't time to think anymore, so they chose it and sent it to production. It's hard to believe, but the Mexican factory failed. Their soles cracked and couldn't withstand the cold. It was great to watch the athletes running on the football field in Nikes until they fell apart. A more reliable factory was needed, and that's where Niso Iwai helped. Besides the loans they generously gave to the hungry Knight, they also knew about many good factories around the world. They introduced him to 5 factories in Japan. Knight came to one of the factories, showed the workers his flagship model Cortez, and went for lunch. And when he returned to the conference room, there was a freshly made Cortez on the table. Magic, thought Knight. This time the samples were very good, unlike the Mexican mishap. When Knight returned to Oregon, he met with Bowerman. They noticed that the outer sole of sneakers had not changed at all for the past 50 years. The tread patterns were always the same, either waves or grooves across the foot. And this sole had very weak grip on the ground. After that, Bowerman thought about it all day long and racked his brains. And one day he noticed that waffle makers had an unusual ridged surface. It intrigued him. He stole a waffle maker from his wife and brought it to his garage, and on a sheet of stainless steel, he cut out holes exactly like those in the waffle makers, poured liquid rubber and made a mold. And in the end, he had 2 soles covered with thick, hard rubber spikes. He sewed the spikes onto the soles of the sneakers, and the runner dashed like a rocket. Bowerman was divinely inspired. He was creating history like Leonardo da Vinci. Knight immediately sent them into production. Then Knight had a rare chance to showcase Nike sneakers to the world. In 1972, a trade show for manufacturers was held in Chicago. Interestingly, Knight's sworn enemy, Onitsuka, was also at the trade show. At that time, they continued to pressure him, wanting him to sell his company to them as soon as possible. They wanted Knight to solemnly announce to everyone at the show that he was parting ways with his company. They had even trumpeted this purchase in the press. When Nike sneakers arrived at the show from the new Japanese factory, their quality still didn't measure up to the quality of Tiger's. Some models were even raw. The Swoosh logo looked awkward. Knight saw this and grabbed his head, realizing the missed opportunity. He was already burdened with a heap of debt and on the brink of collapse, and now this. It couldn't get any worse. But there was no other choice. He had to sell what he had. The traders approached, felt the sneakers, and someone said, "What is this crap?" "It's Nike, the goddess of victory, and the logo is the sound you hear when someone passes by you," replied Knight. Strangely enough, the traders liked it a lot, and they began to place orders. But Johnson couldn't hold back and shouted, "Hey guys, the sneakers haven't even been tested. They're not as good as you think, and you're buying them up. What's going on?" The trader laughed and said, "We've been doing business with Blue Ribbon for years, and we know you guys tell it like it is. Everyone else is pulling the wool over our eyes, but you guys are cutting the truth. That's why we trust you." In the end, the results of the trade show exceeded all expectations. Blue Ribbon was a resounding success. Good news spreads quickly, but bad news spreads even faster. Onitsuka somehow found out about Nike sneakers, and their manager approached Knight and asked, "What is this Nike?" "Just a side business, nothing special. A backup plan in case you cheat us," replied Knight. The answer disarmed Onitsuka's manager because it sounded reasonable and logical. The manager didn't even know what to say. He was geared up for a fight, but Knight deftly parried. And although the fight didn't happen, the cunning Onitsuka still broke the contract and presented Knight with a bill for $17,000 for past shoe deliveries. The case smelled of a lawsuit. Meanwhile, Knight invested money in the career of runner Steve Prefontaine, a student of Bowerman, because at that time Prefontaine was a superstar. Wherever he went, a crowd always gathered around him. Prefontaine always put on a spectacular show when he ran. Every movement he made during his run caused an explosion of admiration, and the crowd of fans became overexcited and went into a frenzy. Prefontaine traveled around the country on behalf of Nike and attended all sports events. He preached Nike like a gospel and brought thousands of converts to the store. In 1972, he set a new U.S. record in running, and he did it in Nike shoes. Thanks to this, he generated thousands of dollars for the company, turning Nike into a symbol of rebellion. In 1973, sales increased by another 50% to reach $4.8 million. This figure was staggering, considering that just yesterday they were selling only $8,000 worth of shoes. During those times, the demand for sneakers was constantly increasing. Suddenly, the whole world was eagerly demanding sneakers, and as usual, Nike's shelves were empty due to delays in deliveries. Knight was boiling with disappointment, and although the new factories were doing much better than Onitsuka, the rapidly growing market was putting more and more pressure on them. Meanwhile, Nike was also heavily in debt, and like poor paupers living from paycheck to paycheck, they walked on the edge of the abyss. Then in 1974, there was a trial with Onitsuka. A few minutes before the start, Knight offered Onitsuka to withdraw his lawsuit if they paid him $800,000. But Onitsuka rejected the offer. They thirsted for blood, as Knight's history of document theft and spy recruitment made his chances of winning very slim. At the trial, Onitsuka claimed that Blue Ribbon lured them into partnership through deception, and that in 1962, Knight pretended to be the owner of a non-existent company, and then resorted to tricks, theft, and espionage. Hearing this, Knight was at a loss for words, and his justifications sounded false and evasive. But an honest witness was found in Onitsuka himself, who told the whole truth and completely refuted Onitsuka's position that it was she who first planned to break the contract with Blue Ribbon. And in the end, the judge ruled in favor of Phil Knight. Onitsuka also had to pay damages of $400,000 for non-targeted use of the trademark. And Knight retained all rights to his Cortez and Boston models. As they had barely celebrated their victory in court when the yen exchange rate began wildly fluctuating and Japanese factories became too expensive. Therefore, Knight decided to produce a certain amount of sneakers in the United States. Contrary to the bank's demands, Knight continued to push the gas pedal to the floor. He believed in the strategy of either growing or dying. Why order 2 million sneakers if there is demand for 3? Knight was on the brink of disaster, always paying bills at the last minute, just enough to avoid getting kicked out by bankers. From the outside, it seemed like a bold and dangerous way of doing business, but fortunately, demand always exceeded sales. Sometimes the loan payments were so huge that the company was completely broke for a while. Of course, living like this was impossible, and the fateful Black Day came. In the spring of 1975, Knight found himself staring into the abyss. For the first time, he owed $1 million in payments, and there was nowhere near $1 million around. He was short $75,000. He had to squeeze every last drop out of his bank accounts in his own stores across the country, completely dry. 2 days later, a crowd of angry workers gathered at the doors of the Exeter factory. Their paychecks were not cashed at the bank. Knight was shaking with fear. The workers had nothing to pay with, and the bank refused to issue a new loan. Luckily, Nisho EY came to the rescue and paid Knight's debt. At that time, thanks to the waffle soles, Nike sneakers flew off the shelves like hotcakes. The sneakers had just appeared, but they were already selling everywhere. This meant that Nike had identified Onitsuka and even Puma. In the waffle sneakers, feet felt and looked different. And with their low price, the waffle sneakers captured the imagination like no previous model. Their appearance attracted hundreds of thousands of new customers. Their grip and cushioning were better than any other footwear on the market. Waffle sneakers in 1976 transformed from a secondary accessory to a cult artifact. Retailers begged for these sneakers. In the same year, at the qualifying tournament for the Olympic Games in Eugene, Nike had 3 runners in its sneakers who were medalists. The Nike brand was heard more often than the name of any athlete. Seeing this, Puma was close to suicide out of envy. To continue growing, it was important to increase production, but American factories were too expensive, as were Japanese factories. But Taiwanese factories were growing like mushrooms after the rain to fill the void left by Japan. And Knight found himself several good Taiwanese factories. By the end of 1976, Nike had doubled its sales volume once again, reaching 14 million, an impressive figure. Financial analysts noticed and wrote about it in the press. Nevertheless, Nike still had cash flow problems. Knight continued to borrow money wherever he could. And then a super strange man with a crazy idea came to Knight. It was a space engineer named Frank Rudy. He came up with the idea of injecting air into sneakers to improve their shock absorption. This seemed foolish, as there had been no major breakthroughs in shoe design for 200 years, and it was hard to imagine that something so revolutionary could be invented. Therefore, wherever he went, all companies refused him. But Knight decided to give it a try. He inserted these soles into his shoes, and they turned out to be damn good for running. Thus, in 1977, the legendary Nike Air model was born. At the time, they looked like they had been teleported from the future. Then another strange inventor came to the company, Sonny Vaccaro. He invented the Dapper Dan Classic game, which became super popular among American schools, allowing Vaccaro to get acquainted with all the coaches. Knight hired him, and Vaccaro began to sign contracts and took over all the great people, all the coaches, and all the famous players. If everyone had contracts with Adidas and Converse before, now everyone wore only Nike. Vaccaro hacked the basketball market. Therefore, in 1977, sales were growing at a geometric rate, but suddenly there was a bill for a debt of $25 million from U.S. Customs. These were taxes for 3 years. It was unthinkable. If Knight paid such a sum, he would inevitably be ruined. Behind this were the cunning competitors Converse and Keds. To slow down Nike's development, they lobbied bureaucrats, convinced customs officials, using some super ancient law about the American selling price. The essence of the law is that the duty is 20% of the competitors' prices if they have similar shoes. So they released a little similar shoes and raised prices to the sky. A dirty trick. Richard Verschulla was sent to Washington to process politicians. He sent petitions, lobbied, passionately defended Nike. He raced around Congress like crazy, handing out sneakers to everyone. After a few months, Verschulla had a nervous breakdown and almost went crazy, never achieving his goal. Therefore, Knight later personally went to Washington and met with the bureaucrat who sent him that check for $25 million and told him, "The American selling price does not apply to Nike. This is a dirty maneuver of competitors. This will knock Nike out of business. This is only done by corrupt countries. However, the bureaucrat repeated only one thing. What should happen will happen. Then Knight filed an antitrust lawsuit in the district court, stating that competitors conspired to drive him out of the market. They did not expect this. The bureaucrat freaked out and threatened to crush Knight. But his bosses and bosses of his bosses did not want this war. Competitors and their accomplices in the government realized that they had underestimated Knight, and they made concessions, dropping the tax from 25 to 20 million. But Knight refused and went further. He released an advertisement in which a small company fights against a bad government. This ad seriously heated up public opinion, and the bureaucrats dropped duties even to 15 million. But Knight continued to refuse. And when the amount reached 9 million, Knight finally accepted the settlement and wrote a check. As soon as the war with the bureaucrats ended, they began to think about issuing shares to finally stop being perpetual beggars. But Knight couldn't bear the thought that some titan would buy up all the shares and turn into a behemoth in the boardroom. He didn't want to lose control. However, a way was found to become public without losing control. Preferred shares were issued specifically for Knight. On December 2, 1980, the company went public. The following week, Knight was valued at $178 million. A fantastic figure. A figure that meant a lot, but also meant nothing, Knight thought. In 1984, Sonny Vaccaro insisted on investing in basketball player Michael Jordan. However, Jordan did not want to sign a contract, and to persuade him, master negotiator Vaccaro said an unusual phrase that no one understood at the time. "You will become a brand. You will have sneakers with your name." This phrase, along with a $2.5 million check and a generous percentage of sales, made Jordan reconsider. Nike specially designed personalized Air Jordan sneakers for him. The shoes were perfect for the lateral attackers who landed with a threefold load on their foot. They were black and red, but the basketball league considered those colors too flashy, and Jordan's action too audacious. He was fined $5,000. But despite everything, Jordan continued to wear the sneakers in every game, and Nike willingly paid his fines, attracting even more attention to these shoes. No one expected it, and this situation only fueled the fans' interest in Jordan, who was still unknown at the time. Nike's sales grew from $870 million to $4 billion a year. The idea that the subject of advertising should not be the product itself, but those who wear it, was revolutionary for those days. It even got to the point of ridiculousness. At the 1992 Olympics, during the award ceremony for the American basketball team's gold medals, Michael Jordan and almost the entire team stood on the podium covering the Reebok logo, because they had a contract with Nike. This was a shock to the sports world. No one expected that business would now control everything in sports. The following year, Sporting News unexpectedly declared Knight the most influential person in sports. For the first time in history, this title went not to an athlete, but to a manufacturer. In 2004, Phil Knight stepped down from his position as CEO and president of Nike, but remained as the honorary chairman of the board. And here is his advice: find your calling. If you follow your calling, it will be easier to endure fatigue. Failures will only fuel you, and the surge of energy will be like nothing you have ever experienced. There is never just business, and there never will be. And if there is, it means that business is bad. The advice may seem obvious, but Knight spent a lot of time pondering the puzzle of how he was able to achieve all of this. And he came to the conclusion that everyone simply liked the story of regular guys from Oregon who were obsessed with running. Dear viewers, thank you for taking the time to watch our video on the history of Nike. We hope you found it informative and engaging. It was a pleasure to have you with us on this journey through the origins of one of the world's most iconic brands. We appreciate your support and hope to see you again soon for more exciting content. Until then, take care and stay inspired. Best regards.